seen. So I've set the record now. It's just for some people I know can't join us. There's a couple of people from Australia that particularly want to join, and then they realised it's 5 o'clock in the morning where they are, and so they're going to catch up later. I think probably most of you have been along to one of my tours at some point over the last few months. If you haven't, let me introduce myself. I'm Andrew Baxter. I'm a professional tour guide based in the Scottish Highlands, a very chilly and windy Scottish Highlands at the moment here near Glencoe. We're down to around about, I think it was 13 degrees Celsius today, when last weekend it was around 26, which is unusual in the Scottish Highlands. We had some fair weather. The one advantage of it being suddenly cold and windy is the monster midges that have suddenly emerged over the last 3 weeks have disappeared because they don't like the wind and they don't like cold temperatures. And they've probably been the most ferocious that I've seen in the last 5 or 6 years. There's one advantage to that. It means that those pesky English tourists that are clogging up our roads at the moment are all heading south again. And for some of you, you may know that here in Kinlochleven, where we live, our family business, other than me tour guiding, is we own the local post office. And we have completely sold out of midge nets and midge spray over the last fortnight. I've never seen them rush out the door so quickly. So there is a bonus to having all those English tourists around. It means that we've sold record numbers of insect repellent and head nets. So let's get going. We're heading to the wild west, very much part of my territory. I'm a Scottish Highlands specialist. That's where I tend to do all my tours. And this tour takes us back on our second trip to Mull. Some of you joined me on a trip through the southern part of Mull and on to the Holy Island of Iona back in June, I think it was. But we're also going to head across to the mainland as well, a place called the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. So what I will do is, if you can just bear with me, I will get my slides up for you all to see. And hopefully you can all see a map there. Someone put their thumbs up just to confirm that you can see a map. So I thought I would put this up just to get your bearings so you can see where we're heading. So Edinburgh's right in the bottom right-hand corner of the map of the screen there. Glasgow's sort of towards the centre. And then you can probably see Glencoe up sort of in the middle of the map. That's where I live, and we're heading across to where I have circled in black, the northern part of the Isle of Mull, and then this series of peninsulas across the water from them with wonderful romantic names, a whole series of peninsulas that jot down from the road to the Isles between Fort William and Mallaig, with names like Ardgour, Morven, Sunnet, Moydart, and Ardnamurchan, which is where we're going to head towards the end of the tour. And then, although we're not really heading there's at least one photo of one of the islands which are known as the Small Isles, and I've circled those in red so you can just get your bearings if I start talking about the Small Isles. And they have wonderful names as well: Rum, Egg, Muck, and Canna, with Rum being the largest one you can see there. And I'm going to mention one of those when we get to Ardnamurchan Lighthouse, which is towards the end of our tour. And in the meantime, I'm just going to get a drink. And this is for Avril and all the celebrations in their household this week. So it's not Scotch this week. I've gone for a rather nice Australian Shiraz, and appropriately called Voyage. And it sort of fits in with my tour, as you can see later. I can see Avril absolutely aghast that I haven't got for South African wine, but we do have a South African connection later on in the tour. Do feel free at any point if you have a question, you want me to go back a bit, explain something a bit more, unmute yourself and just hop in and shout out, and I will try and answer things for you. So first of all, before we head off, I just wonder who out of you have had the opportunity, if at all, to visit Mull in the past. Has anyone been to Mull before? I can see Avril putting her hands up. The Camerons are shaking their heads. Avril's mum's been to Mull. Yeah, okay, so no one. So I'm assuming then, so few have been to Mull, that maybe no one's been to Ardnamurchan either. No, I don't think anyone's saying they've been to Ardnamurchan. Oh, yeah, Avril's mum's been to Ardnamurchan. Well, anyone that's thinking of coming to Scotland in the future.
We've also been, Andrew.
Oh, and Nikki's been as well. Yes, I think you said that in your email to me earlier in the week. For anyone who hasn't been to either Mull or Ardnamurchan, many people head to Mull and then they miss out Ardnamurchan, which I would say is a real hidden secret. And not many tourists or visitors head there, mainly because it's so remote and transport connections are pretty difficult. But you would be discovering so much of Scotland if you made your way there. I heartily recommend it. So, for those of you who came on the Mull tour, you will recall that we went there by ferry from the mainland across the water from the harbour town of Oban. Today, I am flying you there to Mull's International Airport, Glenforsa Airfield, with the wind sock there, just a few miles from the ferry terminal. And this airfield, it's that grass strip, was opened in 1965 by the British Army, built it. And it was originally built as an air ambulance facility for the residents of Mull, and I'm told since it opened all those years ago, they still transport on average one patient every month by air ambulance off the island and down to the main hospitals in Glasgow. So it's a really vital lifeline link for the island. You used to be able to fly there on a commercial flight. You could get a flight that took all of half an hour from Glasgow. It's called the Glasgow Air Service, and that ran up until the 1980s when the ferry service was improved, and then the scheduled air service went out of service. It was no longer needed, and I thought I would show you. Oh, my screen is just frozen. Oh, there we are. There we are. It's taken a little longer than I thought. I would show you a bird's eye view as you come into land at the international airport. And you can see there's a few hazards on the runway there. I think those might be sheep. And I checked the airport website early on in the week, and it actually specifically gives pilots a guide to landing there, and it says that you should be aware that occasionally there are sheep and geese on the runway, and so to be careful on approach. And we've had some famous visitors here that have flown in here. Robert Wagner, the American actor. David Coulthard, if anyone's into motor racing, he's a licensed pilot. Grand Prix British racer, and Tom Cruise himself has flown into Glenforsa Airfield. So if any of you are pilots and you're tempted to come this way, quite a journey from South Africa, admittedly, in a light aircraft, there are, you can come to Mull in that particular way. Maybe you won't make the mistake of a former owner of Harrods, that grand grocery store in London's Knightsbridge, the epitome of luxury, where all the stars and royalty shop. Well, a former owner called Sir Hugh Fraser arrived on Mull at the airfield in his helicopter with a number of gentlemen friends, and they all hopped off the helicopter and it flew away. And the owner of the hotel, who owns the airfield, got into a disagreement with Sir Hugh because he hadn't paid his landing fee for the helicopter. And Sir Hugh rather gruffly replied that he had no intention of paying a landing fee because the helicopter never touched the ground, and that they had stepped off it whilst it was still hovering before departing. And this disagreement and dispute was only settled when Sir Hugh agreed to buy doubles for everyone in the hotel bar as his way of avoiding the landing fee. I rather suspect it cost him considerably more in the end than actually stumping up, I think, the £10 fee to actually land on the strip. So we're going to head on up the coastline to a churchyard. Anyone who's been on previous tours will know that I'm quite fond of old churchyards and graveyards. In fact, I've been I spent a considerable time early on in this week stumbling around the one in Stirling, because I'm just finishing off an audio tour for Stirling Old Town. But this is very different. This is much plainer. Probably been a graveyard and some form of church here for well over 1,000 years. And unusually, the historical records, this is a place called Pennygown. The historical records here are really scant. There's not a lot of information about this churchyard at all. We have the remains of a really small chapel. You can see the gable end of it there. There's a local legend that it was never actually finished and that it only had the four walls and the two gable ends. It never had a roof. And one of the legends says that when the workmen went home at the end of the day, they would lay up their tools and go home, and in the next morning they would find their work from the previous day had been dismantled and the stones from the building rolled away. And this continued for day after day and week after week. And it was only after some time when the workmen returned and saw that their handiwork had been dismantled once again that they eventually gave up, realizing that this part of Mull was inhabited by fairies, by what we call in the Highlands the wee folk. You never refer to them as fairies, and these are quite sinister supernatural beings, and they like playing tricks on human beings. And it was a sign that they didn't want the chapel built on their particular land. There's another story about the fairies that suggests that these were good fairies and that they liked helping human beings, and they were so friendly that they would grant wishes to visitors to the graveyard. But one local made the mistake one day by leaving a small piece of wood on the grass and saying very loudly that he wished the wee folk turned it into a fine ship's mast for his boat for him to go fishing. And the fairies were so aggrieved at this appalling request and work that would involve them toiling away for many hours that they never granted the wish, and they left the graveyard immediately afterwards, never to be seen again. And we have lots of stories like that across the Highlands of fairies being rather aggrieved that people demanded more from their wishes than that they were entitled to. So just going to get a bit of a closer look on that end gable wall. So I think this rather weathered memorial stone, from what I can work out, it belongs to the MacLeans of Duart Castle. And the MacLeans were a once mighty clan on the west coast. They dominated and owned much of Mull and across on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula as well. and very close by to this stone there are two horizontal grave slabs, rather overgrown by moss and grass. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a photo of them anywhere. And one has an effigy of a knight on the top of it, and on the other one it has an effigy of a lady. And many people suggest that this is a former chief and his lady of the clan MacLean. And the chiefs of Clan MacLean do not have a very good reputation as being nice people, because one of them in former times tied his wife, who had rather grown tired of, to a rock out in the ocean in the hope that she would be swept away as the rising tide came around her. And he came to an rather sticky end as a result, because his wife survived this ordeal and eventually got her revenge. And another chief burst in to his widowed mother's wedding and slaughtered, a bit like a scene out of Game of Thrones, most of the wedding guests, and then proceeded to torture his stepfather for several days thereafter. So you get the sort of measure as to what the clan chiefs were like. And it suggested that buried outside the chapel is the clan chief, another clan chief and his wife, who had practiced in witchcraft and sorcery, so much so that it is said that they partook in the roasting of cats on a spit. And in ancient Scottish folklore, such practices are said to summon the devil himself. And it's said that they are buried outside the chapel because of their wickedness and their dabbling in a black magic. Now, I'm not so sure, because they're still buried in a Christian graveyard. If they were really the graves of that particular wicked couple, they would probably be buried in unconsecrated ground. And they are really elaborate, carefully carved slabs like that in the photo in front of us. So they were still considered high status and important people. So I guess we will never know who is really buried next to the chapel in Pennygown, and whether it is really the evil clan chief and his wife as suggested. So we'll leave stories of witchcraft behind, and we'll head up the coast just a couple of miles from Pennygown. I'm not going to linger here very long, but I couldn't resist this particular photo. It's one of my favorites, possibly the most photographed boats anywhere in Scotland. This is on the foreshore just outside the small village of Sarlen. And I'm told by a local guide colleague from Mull that these were bought here in the 1970s, and are what she describes as a local character was going to do them up as a weekend job. Now, the ladies out there will probably understand this, that the men in their life will often say, of course, dear, I will get round to doing that. And you're nagging him for the next 20 years about fixing that door handle that you asked him to fix in 1997, a bit like my wife. And maybe that's exactly what happened here, because he never got round to restoring these old fishing boats, and it won't be long before they disappear into the sea altogether. I think this photo was taken 3 or 4 years ago, and there's a third boat just off shot, which I am told has almost completely disintegrated. So if you drive on the road to Tobermory through Mull, if you do end up visiting Mull, then you will pass these boats. So a good place to stop. And you get a good view across the Sound of Mull. That's that strip of water you can see behind the boats across to the mainland. You can see how close it is, not very far at all, probably 20 minutes on the ferry from one side to the other. And I think that's looking back towards the Morven Peninsula, which we're going to head to now. because here we are over the other side, a place called Loch Allen, but a particular geological feature. We're looking back from the mainland back across to Mull in the distance, and this is the Ardnamurchan, or in English it's the wishing stone, but that's an anglicised version of Ardnamurchan, and it doesn't translate exactly. Ardnamurchan probably means the boundary stone, and many archaeologists think that this marked the boundary between the ancient kingdom of the Picts that dominated most of mainland Scotland up until about the year 900, and then the other side of it would have been the kingdom of Dalriada, or what eventually became known as Scotland. So the Scots came across from Ireland, swept up the west coast, and eventually, over the period of probably about 300 years, took over most of Pictish land, all of Pictish land, to form the nation we know as Scotland. And in later years, in the medieval period, this was probably the boundary between church parishes. But it indicates what the geology of this area is like. It's very volcanic, as we will see later, and this was a stream of lava that pushed its way through cracks in underlying rocks and eventually solidified, and the rocks around it have eroded over millions and millions of years, much softer, and left this volcanic dike with the eroded hole in the middle. So it's the wishing stone, and it's said your wish is granted not by fairies here, as it is on Mull, but by filling your mouth with water from a local spring just up the hillside from here, and then passing through that hole without touching any of the rocks or swallowing the water 3 times. And if you can do that, your wishes will be granted. Now, I've never tried it. I think the next time I head down there, I'm going to actually stop. I've driven past it many times and actually see if I'm not going to fill my mouth with water, but I'm actually going to see if I can actually get through there without touching the rock at all. I'm not, it may be on tricky ground, so it might be a bit more difficult than I thought. In more recent times, we know that this was an important stop-off for funeral processions, and this isn't unusual in the Highlands. So quite often, particularly during the 17 and 1800s, and if you were part of a particular local clan, you probably had to travel many, many miles, dozens of miles, to be buried in the clan graveyard. And this was one of the stopping off points. Around this area, there are evidence of cairns, and historians believe those are what are called coffin cairns. When funeral parties would come by, they would place a stone on the ground, and that mound of stones would grow over time, and eventually it would be the signal that this was the place to stop and rest a while before you headed on to your eventual church destination. And that church probably, oh, I've gone slow again. There we are. That church is probably this place, just a couple of miles down the road, called Kiel Church. There's still a church that stands there today, a Victorian church, but this is a much older medieval ruins of a church. We know it stands on a place that St. Columba established a monastery sometime in the 500s. He was a great Celtic missionary saint, and you can wander around the ruins, but actually that's not the most interesting part, even though the ruins are quite interesting, because it's what is inside the church. There you can see the little Victorian church there. It's what's within the graveyard itself that's interesting, and within the church. So you've got this mighty Celtic cross, 2.5 meters high, I think, from recollection, probably dates back to around the 1300s. Been standing in that spot ever since. Quite intricately carved. There's dragons on one side and these flower leaf motifs on the other side. And then within the church, we have these grave slabs that you can see on the right-hand side. Really intricately carved. These, up until relatively recently, were all outside in the graveyard, and eventually they found room within a meeting room in the church to house them and protect them from the elements and to protect them from erosion. And most of these stones date back to the same time as the cross. So probably around 900 years old. And we've got a really fine example of a bishop in the foreground there. And it meant that this place must have been really important, possibly at one time as important as Iona, as a monastery, because it was only the most richest, most powerful individuals in the Highlands that would have had grave slabs like these carved. Can you see the intricacy of the craftsmanship on these stones? So it could only be the richest, like a bishop or a clan chief, that would have had these stones engraved and made for them. So this is a really, I don't know, Nikki, you said you've been to Ardnamurchan. Did you visit this part of the peninsula? Did you know about this church and the carved stones there? Put you on the spot there so I can get another drink.
No, I actually never went there.
And I think you're probably like many other people that visit here. It's hidden away. It's not signposted from the road, but it has this amazing collections of stones. So if you are heading this way, I would recommend finding it out and finding the place. Now, we're just up the road from there. This is a place called Lach Beg, as you can see on the slide. And you might think this is a fairly unremarkable building, probably from the 1930s, 1940s by the look of it. It's actually a whole terrace of buildings, of houses. I think there's maybe 8 in the block altogether. And I put that here because of an event that occurs tomorrow. So tomorrow is the 90th anniversary of the evacuation of the last residents of the island of St Kilda in 1930. It occurred on 29th of August 1930 when the last 36 residents of St Kilda had petitioned the British government because they felt that they could no longer survive on this particular island, and you'll see the reason why soon. And they petitioned them to be moved and housed on the mainland. And those 36 families, some of them were housed in these houses on the Morven Peninsula at Lach Beg. Unfortunately, there are none of the original families left, none of the relatives are left in the area. I think the last granddaughter of any of the original inhabitants moved away just a few years ago from the area. And just to show you why perhaps they asked to come to Morven. So Morven is right down at the bottom of the screen, just above where it says Google. And the island of St Kilda, I could be really mean and say, can anyone show me where it is? But I will won't do that. And the arrow is pointing out to it. It's a tiny rocky outcrop way out in the Atlantic Ocean where the blue arrow is. And I think it's 45 miles from the next nearest island of North Uist. The islanders lived there for centuries, and eventually it was just impossible for them to survive in the modern world. They were racked with disease. There's a suggestion that the population was so small that they couldn't safely have marriages without interbreeding within the population, and that had led to lots of disabilities. And so eventually they appealed to the government to come and evacuate them. And they were relocated in Morven, the very last set of families. Others had already left in the years preceding that. And I'm just going to show you a video with some photos from St Kilda itself, so you can see what life was like. I won't play the whole video, but you can see what they were leaving behind in the early 1930s and see how tough life must have been there. So most of the men were crofters. They eked out a life on this rocky outcrop. They scaled the cliffs to hunt the seabirds, which was an important part of their diet. They lived in these small stone houses, lashed by the Atlantic storms. Quite a close-knit community, as you can imagine. You can still visit St Kilda. That high street that we could see there remains. It's a World Heritage centre, quite difficult to get to. The weather has to be really spot on for you to get there. This is how rocky it is. Where the houses you can see is really the only flat bit, and it is really just a series of sea stacks. So there's two islands quite close together, so you can see how precipitous it is, and served by their small harbour. So I won't carry on playing the rest of it. If you're interested, do Google St Kilda. There's lots of photographs, lots of videos out there for you to discover. We'll continue on with the tour. And all of a sudden I've got a pile of timber and logs. And the reason I put that there is that is exactly what the men of St Kilda were put to work to do. They were used to plant the forestry plantations around the Morven Peninsula and through much of the west coast. They were particularly good at planting saplings on steep slopes, which is unsurprising because they were spent much of their time hunting birds. The only problem, the only irony of putting these men to work in our forestry was there's not a single tree anywhere on the island of St Kilda because it's so storm-tossed, trees simply cannot grow there. So for most of those men, if they had never been to the mainland before, they were set to work planting trees, having never seen a tree before in their entire life, which I find quite extraordinary. But that's what happened to St Kildans and the link to this part of the country. So we're spoken about an island way out in the Atlantic. Well, we're going to talk about a whole continent now, right in the southern hemisphere, because this is our Australian link during this tour. It may surprise you that this little building here, this little mausoleum, is actually back on the island of Mull, and it's owned by the National Trust of Australia, and it's cared for, and its upkeep is paid for by the National Trust of Australia. And that's because buried within it is a man called Major General Lachlan Macquarie, who was born on the island of Ulva, which is just off the coast of Mull, in 1761. He proved himself a very successful soldier within the British Army, particularly at a time as the British Empire expanded, was stationed in India, amongst many other places. And eventually he was asked or ordered by the British government to become the governor of New South Wales. And he was ordered to do so to get things back in order, to restore strict British order in the colony after a rebellion had swept through New South Wales and thrown out the previous governor, who, when I say the name, may be familiar to many of you. because it was one William Bligh. And any of you who like old black and white movies may remember Mutiny on the Bounty, because William Bligh was the captain of the Bounty, who his crew mutinied against him, and then it seems that the colonialists in New South Wales then rebelled against him there. And he was replaced by Lachlan Macquarie, who was so successful. He is still to this day by many considered the father of Australia. And in fact, the inscription on the mausoleum describes him as the father of Australia. He helped turn Botany Bay into what is now Sydney. And he was the man first to use the term Australia on any official document. So we have Lachlan Macquarie to thank for that. But what's really interesting, it seems as though the explorers down in New South Wales soon learned how to get the governor's support for any adventures that they had. And it wasn't bribery. It wasn't marrying any of his daughters. The ideal way to get the governor to agree to you granting them some land was to name it after him. So if you end up in Australia, you'll find a Macquarie River, a Lachlan River, Mount Macquarie, Lake Macquarie, Port Macquarie, a town called Lachlan, Macquarie Harbour, Macquarie Pass, Macquarie Lighthouse, and a Macquarie Island. And that's before you even get onto the hospital that's named after him, or the university, or the bank. So a man born in one of the remotest parts of the Scottish Highlands is renowned across Australia today. Many of the places are named after him. And after he finished his governorship, he came back to Britain and eventually was buried in his clan lands on the Isle of Mull, just outside a small village called Grulin, where he would have grown up. So we're going to head on away from our Australian connection to this beautiful photo, Loch na Kail, looking out towards the Atlantic Ocean with some islands sort of guarding the entrance to this sea loch. This is quite a good photograph to demonstrate this area's volcanic past. So that headland on the left-hand side, you may be able to see there's lines running along it. And if you had a closer look, there's even more lines than those you can see in the photo. And geologists have worked out there's probably 50 layers of volcanic rock from volcanic eruptions that occurred around 65 million years ago, over many million years, and laid down new layers of volcanic rock across each other. And these islands in the distance, well, I suppose in a way they have quite a strong German connection. One of them, called Eorsa, was bombed by the Germans in the Second World War because they mistakenly thought it was a battleship. And then they were somewhat surprised when it didn't sink, which I'm not sure says much about the bombers or German intelligence of the west coast of Scotland, but even so. And then another island is called Inchkenneth, and has the remains of a rather grand country house upon it, which is a house associated with a family of young ladies who were, if you like it, the it girls of the 1930s and the 40s, the Mitford sisters. And they definitely had German connections. One of them, called Unity, so adored Hitler and the German Nazi Party that she met the Führer on no less than 140 occasions between 1935 and 1939. And at the start of the Second World War, she was so horrified at the start of war, she attempted suicide but failed. And eventually She died in the late 1940s at her family home on Inchkenneth. But it doesn't stop there. Her older sister, called Diana, married the British fascist leader, Oswald Mosley. So they were quite a notorious family. Another sister was a renowned communist that loved nothing better than drawing the communist hammer above swastikas. But what I find most extraordinary, despite having three sisters that would say had a cloud hanging over them, the youngest sister, Deborah, became the very pillar of British society because she married into high aristocracy and became the Duchess of Devonshire and the lady of one of the most famous houses in the whole of England, Chatsworth House, down in Derbyshire. And in fact, she only passed away 4 or 5 years ago. So wasn't their main home, it was sort of holiday home, was in Loch Nankiel. And let's move on to briefly stop off at another island in the loch. This is Over, which has an interesting history, a recent history, because the population had been decimated by the Highland clearances in the 1800s. So this was a period when land in Scotland was owned by rich entrepreneurs that weren't particularly interested in the local population. And in the 1840s, it was owned by a solicitor from Stirling, a man called Francis William Clark. And he decided that he wanted to get rid of the crofters and the farmers and put them on boats and send them off to places like Canada and the United States to make way for big sheep farms. And at the beginning of the 1840s, the population on this island was 570. And within a decade, it had declined to just 53. The population had been decimated almost entirely. And by the year 2011, the population had declined to just 11 permanent residents. And again, it was going to be sold by an uninterested landowner. But on this occasion, the residents that were remaining took things into their own hands, and they convinced the Scottish government to back them on a community buyout, and they raised the £4.5 million to buy the island and all the property upon it. And they, just in the last couple of years, about 2 years ago, they took final ownership of the island, and they're now proceeding to build new houses, encourage new businesses back to the island and new families to bring it hope that it will survive into the future and become a thriving community again. And we see that across the country. And it's only a couple of 100 yards from across the water to Mull, but it presents its own challenges. So it's not surprising that the population in modern times had declined so much. And we're going to move on briefly to our Canadian connection. So as you can see, this is Calgary Bay. And this is where many of the men, women and children that were cleared, not just from over, but from across Mull by a variety of landowners in the 1800s, would have said goodbye to their homeland, and they would have headed off on ships across the Atlantic Ocean to a new life many thousands of miles away. Now, many people assume that the modern city of Calgary in Canada, where many of those people ended up nearby, is named after Calgary Bay. What it is, but it wasn't named after the by the immigrants. It was actually named by an officer in the Canadian Mounted Police that used to go to Calgary on holiday as a child before he emigrated to Canada, and he named it from his happy memories. And around this bay, if you were going to go walking through these hillsides, you would discover dozens of ruined buildings, whole villages that were cleared in the 1800s to make way for sheep. And that is the site that would have confronted those families as they left Scotland and the Highlands behind and headed out from Calgary Bay across the Atlantic. And we'll move on to somewhere a bit brighter. I was tempted to sing you a song, but I'm going to resist it because this forever, in my mind, will be associated by one of the most appalling children's TV programs that appeared in the 1990s. I had gone off to university. I had a much younger brother who was still watching children's TV, and he would regale me whenever I came home with, what's the story from Ballymorey, wouldn't you like to know? And it went on like that. And I said I wasn't going to sing to you, so I'm so sorry. But that TV program was filmed here, not in Ballymorey, but in Tobermory, because of all the brightly coloured buildings, and all the characters in the TV program were associated with one of these coloured buildings. So you had the postman, the policeman, and the man in a pink castle, I think, which doesn't actually exist. It's a small harbour built in the late 1700s by the Duke of Argyll. When we had started to lose the American colonies, the British government turned to the north and west of Scotland and decided that they were going to improve things for the residents of the Highlands. And this is an example of it. This is the planned fishing village of Tobermory. It was built for the rather, I'm checking the actual title. It was built by the rather grandly titled British Society for Extending the Fisheries and Improving the Seacoast of the Kingdom. Now, that could only have been dreamt up by a bureaucrat in London. Most often it was known as the British Fisheries Society. It was a planned fishing village, and they would fish the herring fishing grounds off in the Atlantic Ocean. It was never really successful, mainly because it was actually in reality too far for many of those herring fishing grounds. But the legacy is that we have a really fine coastal town today, and I can recommend, if you ever end up there, fish and chips on the pier, but watch out for the natives, the herring gulls that are so rude and quick that they will actually seize the chips out of your hand as they fly past. They are some of the fastest and sneakiest seagulls that I have ever discovered. I'm just going to pause there very briefly just to double check that there are no questions. I realise I've been speaking a lot and I'm slightly behind time, but before I move on, I want to tell you a quick story about Tobermory Bay, because it may come as a surprise that there is a Spanish galleon on the seabed in Tobermory Bay. It comes from the time of the Spanish Armada in the 1500s, when Spain was at war with England, and the Spaniards thought that they were going to overthrow the English monarchy. And one of those ships, the San Juan Batista, got caught in an Atlantic storm and was blown off course. So blown off course, it ended up off the coast of Tobermory. And it was so badly damaged that the clan chief of the MacLeans offered to help with its repair. But mysteriously, it blew up on the 5th of November in 1588 and sunk to the bottom of the bay before it could be repaired at all. But why did it sink? And there's lots of theories and conspiracies abound. There's some that say that the clan chief demanded 100 Spanish troops to act as mercenaries in clan feuds with the Campbells and the MacDonalds, and that it was an act of sabotage when they refused to provide the Spanish troops. Others say that it was simply an accident when some gunpowder ignited on board. Some say that somehow it was sunk by an English spy that had crept aboard without anyone noticing. Others suggest that Maclean simply reneged on his promise to help with repair of the boat, and it was easier for him to sink it instead. Others suggest that the Spanish had intended to sail off from the bay without paying Maclean for the extra supplies, and he had ordered its destruction. Well, I tell you what, I'm not convinced of any of those. Oh, what's that saying there? Or Bridget, you'll have to say, Guy Fawkes Day. Yeah, well, yes, it's Guy Fawkes Day, but 1588 from memory preceded Guy Fawkes by 20, 30 years. Was it 1606, 1605 off the top of my head? But a good guess. It's not. It is Guy Fawkes Day, but nothing to do with Guy Fawkes. A good conspiracy theory from the Camerons there. Well, a local legend says that it was witchcraft that resulted in the sinking of the San Juan Bautista, because Lady Maclean had grown suspicious of her husband spending so much time away from the castle, and she consulted a local seer who revealed that Lord Maclean had fallen into the amorous clutches of a dark-eyed, big-bosomed Spanish beauty, and that she was intent on sinking the boat in revenge. But she didn't order the gunpowder to go off. She needed to consult a witch to do it. And this witch was brought over from Fort William, and the witch said spells on the seashore, and out of the water appeared the most huge, enormous black cats that you have ever seen in your life, probably the size of tigers, and 7 of them in total, and they swam stealthily across the water and crept up the wooden sides of the galleon in search of the clan chief and his Spanish adulteress, and they leapt upon the Spanish marines, tearing out their eyes and tossing them overboard from their huge jaws, searching out the clan chief himself. Now, he had managed to slip down the side of the galleon on the rope and was busy rowing away as fast as he could to get away from these giant witch-induced cats. And the cats continued down to the very bowels of the galleon, and it is said that the static electricity from the fur of one of those cats set off a spark that went boom as it ignited the gunpowder in the very bottom of this galleon, and the splinters of wood flew around Tobermory Bay as it disappeared beneath the waves. And it's said that there is missing gold to the tune of £30 million worth of Spanish gold coins that disappeared with it. And many dives have taken place, led by successive Campbell clan chiefs, and nothing has ever been found. And some suggest it's possibly been taken by locals when it first sank. But that's not quite the end of the story, because it's said that over on Morven, where we were earlier, occasionally you will see a ghost wandering the shoreline of Spanish complexion. How on earth a ghost can have any sort of complexion, let alone Spanish complexion, I'm not sure. And she rummages around the shoreline, lifting up stones and overturning rocks, and she is looking for her missing fingers, because it is said that the Spanish princess that the clan chief had enjoyed so much time was still on board when the explosion took place, and her body is buried somewhere on Morven, missing her finger joints. So, I'm sure you will agree the most likely cause of the sinking of the San Juan Bautista is definitely witchcraft, and none of the other ridiculous conspiracy theories that you heard earlier on. Well, we're going to head back onto the mainland now on the little ferry that takes you about 20 minutes across to Kilhoan. You can see a little castle there in the distance. That's Mingery Castle. Dates back from the Lords of the Isles, the mighty MacDonald clan, so from the 1400s. Recently been restored. It's now a luxury hotel that you can actually, not a hotel, self-catering castle. So you can stay there if you have found some of those Spanish gold coins in Tobermory Bay. You might actually be able to afford the cost of staying in the castle, and it's owned by the same person that owns this place, which to many people would be a rather fine house in itself. This is Glenborrow, and this is the gatehouse. So it's actually not the main residence at all. It's part of the large Glenborrow estate that stretches for thousands of acres across the remote Ardnamurchan Peninsula. And we have a South African connection there. There's the castle. It's a bit of a pixelated picture. And it was built in 1901 by a gentleman called C.D. Rudd. And the castle, he actually built two homes. And he built the castle for his guests. But it's the only building that remains. C.D. Rudd, Charles Rudd, was a partner with one Cecil Rhodes. And between the two of them, they founded the De Beers, a mining company. Rudd made his fortune mining diamonds in Kimberley, which I think is up in the Northern Cape. And it's said that before he died in 1916, somewhere within the grounds of the castle, he buried a large diamond. And successive owners, as well as guests to the castle, have searched for that diamond. And still after 100 years, it still remains missing. The castle and much of the estate was up for sale in 2018, and the going price then was £3.75 million, and it came with the castle, the gatehouse, 103 acres, and your own island. And also the sales particular mentioned the missing diamond, and that you also had ownership of the diamond if you should discover it within the 133 acres. I suspect the owners are still searching to this day. Earlier on, when we were on Mull, I was talking about landowners that had sort of neglected their communities, weren't really interested about the communities, and how many communities have bought out land when it's up for sale. Well, Ardnamurchan has been a bit more progressive, because the current owner of the estate, if not the castle, a man called Donald Houston, has found lots of ways of supporting the local community, and this is one of it. This is one of Scotland's newest distilleries, the Ardnamurchan Distillery, built to look like a traditional distillery, but very, very modern. Opened 5-6 years ago, employs quite a lot of people from the local area. Built on sustainable terms. It's environmentally friendly in terms of the electricity used comes from hydroelectric schemes that built on the estate, and all sorts of other methods as well. Visitor centre and a cafe that provides local jobs, and there's lots of other examples like that around the estate. So that's a sign of good stewardship of our land in many people's eyes. I'm going to just head around, and I I'm going to miss those ones out because we're heading up towards Ardnamurchan Lighthouse. And I wanted to see, let you see. Now, Nikki will know this because you've been over on Ardnamurchan. And apologies if you get a bit car sick on this because it's speeded up, time-lapse video of the road that you need to take to get to Ardnamurchan Lighthouse. I'm only showing a little bit of it to show you it's twisty-turny, single-track road for 23 miles before you get to a road that has traffic in either direction, and that's not much better than this. We're going around the volcanic landscape again. That's the remains of a huge super volcano in the distance. There you can see how rugged the land is, and that it probably wasn't ever very good for agriculture or cultivation, although those crofters we referred to previously certainly attempted to, and that's why much of it was cleared for the sheep that you can see along the road. Many people, when they visit, oh, can you see the deer running up the hillside there on the left-hand side? When he stopped there, missed that. Many people are always amazed that the sheep run so freely across the Scottish Highlands, and they will often ask me, who owns them? Does anyone look after them? Well, they're owned by the local farmer. They will be brought down from the hillsides during the winter months, but most of the year they will be left to roam. Most of them aren't kept for wool anymore because the price of wool a farmer will get next to nothing. They are bred for their lambs that are let out on the hill for a few months before being sold to farmers in the south of Scotland, where they go off to graze there on better pasture land to be fattened up and ready for meat and an Easter roast dinner, no doubt. So probably the biggest obstacle on any of these roads are the livestock. So sheep, quite a lot of cattle, and deer, red deer that we saw a glimpse of just earlier on. So oh, someone's dropped out. So we'll continue on. Just wanted to show you a little bit of what it's like to drive on our roads. Nikki, did you actually do any of the driving when you were here?
No, actually, I haven't been to Scotland at all, hey?
Oh, I thought you had. Sorry.
No, no.
Oh, it was someone
no,
else.
not at all.
Ah,
Yeah, it was somebody else.
it was someone else who had said, sorry, I do apologise. No wonder you look confused. Let's come out of that. Right. Let's continue through. There we are. And this will delight Bridget, who I know, she's nodding her head. Bridget was desperate to have a lighthouse, and I think this is one of the finest. I'm just going to read something to you before I describe the lighthouse. Ardnamurchan Point to Cape Wrath, including the Outer Hebrides. North 3 to 5, becoming variable 3 or less, then occasionally 4 again later. Slight or moderate, becoming smooth or slight later. Showers becoming fair later, good. Now, you might have thought I had just spoken absolute gobbledygook. To me, a Brit, those are some of the finest words in the English language, because that is the BBC shipping forecast from earlier on today. And I remember as a young boy hearing those come across the radio, and these romantic sounding places, including Ardnamurchan Point to Cape Wrath. And I was transported away with those words. And even today, I am. And Ardnamurchan Point features on that twice a day as it goes across the airwaves. And we're not quite on the most westerly point on mainland Britain. That's about 3/4 of a mile south from where we are on a rather rocky outcrop. But I think we're probably on one of the best places that you can stand anywhere in the country. Now, I'm biased because, as it happens, I'm a trustee of the lighthouse. It's been looked after for the last 25 years by the Ardnamurchan Lighthouse Trust, who looked after it but didn't own all the buildings and the land. And I'm delighted to say that in the last week we have just purchased the lighthouse and all the buildings around it, which includes a museum and a cafe, off the local council. So it's within community ownership, run by a local people on behalf of local people. You can visit it. It's one of 97 lighthouses built by a very famous family, the Stevensons family. 3 brothers built lighthouses all around Scotland in the 1800s. And this one was built by Alan Stevenson. And any of you who have read any books like Kidnapped or Dr. Jekyll and Hyde will know that they were written by Robert Louis Stevenson, who is the nephew of the man that built this particular lighthouse. And it first shone out across the treacherous rocks around here in 1849. But the weather is so wild in this part of the world that within 2 years, it was seriously damaged in an enormous Atlantic storm. The lighthouse was struck by lightning. Part of the road leading up to it was washed away. Many of the walls were destroyed, but it still weathers the storms. It still provides information, safe light for shipping along the west coast of Scotland, and is possibly one of the best places to wildlife watch anywhere along the Scottish coast. From the top of that lighthouse, you will see whales, dolphins, porpoises, seals, sea eagles, and the occasional pod of killer whales as well as they head up around our coast. And if any of you are looking to come here, you can actually stay in the lighthouse keeper's house at the very base of the lighthouse there. And in fact, I think at the moment there's a team from a dolphin and whale trust that are staying in there, researchers, and they are doing a whale and dolphin count off the coast. And from the top, well, not from the top, because this is from the base of the lighthouse, you'll get this view, which is an amazing view across to those small isles that I mentioned earlier: Rum, Muck, Canna, and Egg, with Rum right in the very distance on the horizon there. And I've just given you a closer look of Egg itself, again, just to show you the volcanic eruptions that shapes the landscape here. So this is a volcanic plug, a molten volcanic chamber, again, over 60 million years ago, solidified once it cooled, and all the soft rock around it has eroded, leaving the very center of the volcano in the middle. And it may amaze you that you can actually walk up to the very summit of the skirt of Egg without needing any ropes. It's actually surprisingly relatively easy walk, although steep in places, but you don't need any rock climbing skills to do so. And just to prove that it doesn't always rain in Scotland and in the Highlands, and sometimes you could almost think that you are in Barbados, look at the clear blue of that water and the white sandy beaches. I think this is one of the hidden secrets of the West Coast, is our amazing beaches. I'm not saying it wouldn't be cold going in that water, because I can assure you it would be, but the beaches along the West Coast, particularly in places like Santa Bay, are almost unspoilt, and that's because of the lack of transport connections and road infrastructure. If you've got to drive 60 miles return trip on a single track road to get to a beach like this, you have to be pretty determined to get there. And my children have been hinting over the last week that because the weather's fine tomorrow, they would like to take our new puppy for his first outing on a beach, and they're expecting me to take them there, which is 2.5 hours drive from where I live. But hey ho, if the weather's nice, we're probably going to head there. And we're nearly very at the end of our tour, and I wanted to include this place because again it's remote. Most people don't know about it. This is an absolute hidden gem. It's called Castle Tioram, slightly up the coast from where we were earlier. If you had the Google map link that I sent earlier on the week, take a look at it, you'll see where it is exactly. This castle stands on its own little islet. You can only get there via a shingle causeway, which is submerged in the very highest tides, probably built from the 1300s onwards. Anyone who has any MacDonald links, this is important in your clan history, because this was the seat of the Clan Ranalds, an offshoot of the MacDonalds, really strong royalists during the civil wars of the 1600s, and then staunch Jacobites trying to overturn the British monarchy and the government during the 1700s. And in fact, so much so, the clan chief of the Ranalds in 1715, during one of those uprisings, set fire to the castle as he headed off to war in an attempt to stop it falling into government hands. And he headed off to the Battle of Sheriff Muir, never to return as he fell on the battlefield. And it's never been occupied since then. And also, it's site of probably one of the longest and possibly the most saddest and most complicated planning disputes ever in Scottish law, that has been running for the best part of 20 years now, because the owners that had bought it applied to the local council for planning permission to convert the castle, to restore it to a private home. You can see it's crumbling before our eyes here. And that would have meant restoring it, putting a roof on, installing electricity, water supply, and all of those things. And it would have also meant that access to the general public would have come to an end. And somewhat surprisingly, the local council said yes, and they granted planning permission. And then something called Historic Scotland, that looks after many of our buildings, or oversees many of the buildings in Scotland, and ancient monuments like Castle Tioram, said no, were opposed to such a plan. Eventually, after a drawn-out period, it went to public inquiry, and that planning application was refused. So we're in this extraordinary standoff where we have owners that want to restore and preserve what's left of the castle, and we have our historic conservation body who says you can't do so, and will and are not putting any effort into preserving what is left. So that is Castle Tioram, another one of those really hidden gems in Scotland. Whenever I go there, maybe half a dozen people around, maybe a dozen, possibly no more. Again, you've got to be really determined to get there. It's down a really long, narrow, twisty-turny, single-track road. And even though I'm experienced on driving on them, I sort of say a prayer under my breath whenever I head down that road, that I don't meet someone coming in the opposite direction, which involves me having to reverse a long distance so that we can get past each other. And that's our final photo today, a panorama to get the real feeling of Castle Tioram, just off the mainland there. I think that's, yeah, on the left-hand side. You might just be able to work out that you can walk across to the island there when the tide is low. So I've gone way over time. I hope that's okay with you. There was so much that I wanted to share with you of this really hidden part of the country. And so before we call everything to the end, I'm just going to take the screen down and just check if there are any questions, anything you want to ask about that whistle-stop tour around Scotland's Wild West. If you're trying to ask me a question, you need to unmute. I think, who was that trying to ask you a question?
Good night, everybody. Andrew, I'm sorry that I wasn't there. My computer froze.
Oh, no.
So I'll have to have a look at the recording. Thank you for recording it, not like last time. And I'll just say good night to my Leanne and Justine.
Good night.
I'm unmuted now.
Ah.
I just want to say how much I really, really enjoyed it. And I actually think I'm actually related in some way to McLean of Cork. So, you know, I think they sound like a naughty bunch of people.
That's quite a delicate way of putting it. I hope you didn't inherit the naughty gene from the McLeans.
I definitely didn't. But I absolutely found it fascinating because I come from Scotland and I married a South African. And this is why I'm so very, very interested.
Oh, well, I'm delighted. Thank you.
And I loved every moment. Thank you so much.
That's very kind. Oh, and Avril said, take photos on my trip to Santa Bay. I will, hoping that it will be a nice sunny day, although I think it will be rather chilly. And if I remember to take photos, I will pop them up on my Facebook page, Glen to Glen Tours, over the next couple of days for you. Any other questions? No.
Thanks, Andrew, very much. We've got a lot to mull about.
Fantastic. Well, it's good to see you all. I can assure you this was recorded. It still says it's recording now. And I will make sure that over the weekend, once it's all been uploaded, that you all have the links to look back at it if there's anything that you missed. And the next tour is on Friday, September the 25th, starting British time, 7 o'clock in the evening. And this time we're heading to the far north. It's loosely called the North Coast 500, which is Scotland's equivalent of America's Route 66. It goes for 500 miles in a big loop right round the far northwest coast of Scotland, up round through Caithness and Sutherland and back down the east coast. I certainly won't be able to cover all of it in that time. I'm going to have to be really strict to try and get it to the hour and not overrun as I have today. So I think I'll probably just pick the 10 highlight places that anyone heading on the North Coast 500 should visit. And in the meantime, I'd like to wish you all a very good night. And as we say in Scotland, haste ye back. See you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.